Hi, everyone. I'm Gabrielle Lipton with Landscape News of the Global Landscapes Forum, and welcome to this session of the storytelling track about the role of science in global narrative and communications. And I'll start by saying that the Global Landscapes Forum is an organization that's founded in science. Our partners are scientific organizations and research institutions. Our events, as you've probably seen at this one, most of our sessions are about science and the latest science. And in my role as an editor, I can say that the stories we publish are about science and communicating those to the world. But communicating science to non-scientists and bridging the gap between scientific fields and the general public is a really hard thing to do. Science is highly technical. It's constantly changing and being updated, and the scientific process is not always readily understood. And it takes an enormous amount of rigor and integrity and objectivity and freedom from outside influences in order for science to be trustworthy. So in this time, when we need science desperately to tackle crises like food security and climate change and pandemics like COVID-19, I'm really excited about this conversation that's about to come between scientist Amy Duchelle and the editor-in-chief of one of the world's most prestigious families of scientific journals, Holden Thorpe. So I'll introduce Amy before turning it over to her to introduce Holden. And I can speak to Amy personally as I've written about her scientific research a number of times. She's one of the foremost scientists at the Center for International Forestry Research, where she serves as team leader and senior scientist in the climate change, energy, and low carbon development team. And she currently lives in Indonesia, but has previously been based in Brazil. She's led massive studies on deforestation and the protection of forests. And I can say that one thing that weaves through all of her work is rights and the protection of justice for people living in landscapes. And I think that's a particularly timely topic and issue right now as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you for organizing this storytelling track of the GLF, which has been really fantastic so far. And special thanks to everyone online who's sticking with us in this last session of the day. You're all participants in this conversation, so please add your comments and questions in the conference app, and we'll be bringing those in the second part of the conversation. So we are here today with Dr. Holden Thorpe, editor-in-chief of the science family of journals, including Science Magazine. Holden is a chemist, inventor, musician, professor, entrepreneur, one of these super people. And prior to his role at Science, he's held many other leadership positions, including as provost of Washington University in St. Louis and chancellor of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the US. So Science Magazine is one of the most widely read and cited publications in the world. It has an impact factor of 41, meaning that any article published there will be cited on average 41 times by other researchers, which is an order of magnitude larger than most other scientific journals. Importantly, it's not only other scientists reading these articles. Messages are picked up broadly by media, used by decision makers, and so if you can publish in science, it's considered a way that we as researchers can make a difference, one way that we can make a difference. As such, it's highly competitive. In 2019, just over 6% of the original research articles submitted were actually accepted for publication. And these days, the journal couldn't be more important. So much of the daily news that we're reading and seeing on our evolving understanding of COVID-19 has passed by the desk of Dr. Holden Thorpe and his colleagues first. So he's in a unique position right now and kind of a bit of a star. So we're really lucky I feel highly honored to be here today with you, Holden, and thank you for taking the time to be at the Global Landscape Forum today.
You bet. It's great to be here, and thanks to you for the important science that you do, because how science relates to the locations that it's in and the people that are there is incredibly important. So thank you for what you do for science as well.
So, I just gave a big, grand introduction to Science Magazine, but it would be interesting to hear from you as an insider, what makes Science Magazine and the Science family of journals so unique and exceptional?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's an honor to be here to talk to you and to represent the Science family of journals. I've been the editor-in-chief for about 7 months. It was an interesting time to come on. Thankfully, I had 6 months with my colleagues before we went to work from home. So I got to interact in person with the brilliant people who have made, long before I got there, Science Magazine and the Science family of journals what it is today. We have a pretty small group of journals, only 6. Our big peers, Nature and Elsevier, have many, many, many more journals. And we're a society journal. We don't, if Science Magazine generates more revenue than we spend, that surplus goes to fund the great work of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in promoting science literacy and arguing for and advocating for changes in science policy. And so, we have a doubly important thing to do. We drive science and science awareness, but we also help enable the great work of the AAAS in advocating for scientific literacy and science and policy. The thing that I think a lot of people would probably imagine could be true, but maybe wouldn't really see until you get to see it firsthand, is that the editors that we have who are doing this extraordinary task that you described of taking 12,000 papers every year and figuring out which 700 of them we're going to publish are extremely knowledgeable and capable scientists. They're different from laboratory scientists because they're much broader, but they read even more papers really than almost anybody in any other part of science would. And so the amount of things that they know and the extraordinary experience and judgment they have is really a privilege to be part of. And the breadth, which goes all the way from social science to quantum computing and everything in between, is really inspiring just to see constantly all the new things that we have. But science doesn't just publish research. We have our insights section, which is very important commentary about science and science policy. And that includes the editorial page that I write for now almost every week myself. And then we have science news, and particularly with COVID, the reporters that we have that have spent their lives learning the beats of infectious diseases are now some of the most sought after reporters in all of journalism. And the way it works is that the news section is editorially independent from research. So I don't direct what they write about, but I strategize with them. And if anybody has any questions about what they write, I help them figure out how to respond to that. So it's really an amazing ride to be the editor-in-chief of Science, and especially working from home and covering a pandemic and living through the extraordinary times where science is so important right now.
Yeah, thank you. It truly is. And over the past few months, you've written these bold editorials that you mentioned, these weekly editorials. I follow them. And I guess the Do Us a Favor is the one maybe that got the most circulation, where you really called out Donald Trump about the need for respect of science and then the scientific process. But there was another editorial from late March that you wrote that actually stuck with me. It was entitled Underpromise, Overdeliver. And you discussed how there could be substantial increase in public interest and trust in science, given its role in the current crisis and understanding the current crisis, but that on the flip side, if the science doesn't meet public expectations, or if politicians are promoting false hope or unrealistic timelines for treatments and vaccines, that actually the consequences for science itself could be quite negative. That was over 2 months ago. It feels like light years ago at this point. But what is your take on the underpromise, overdeliver message now?
Yeah, I'm worried. The reasons that I wrote that piece are still with us, unfortunately. Science is up against a machine of misinformation, and it's digitally sophisticated, and it's been building for 50 years, ever since we first started seeing politicians, mostly on the right, get political advantage by attacking science around mostly the environment. But if you see climate denial, anti-vaccination movements, and now people kind of rejecting what we're saying about coronavirus, that is something that is very sophisticated and very targeted against us. And a lot of times I hear from people who say, well, we're just not telling our story well enough. Well, I don't buy that. If we publish a paper in Science, that's like taking it and shooting it out of a cannon, because it gets, depending on what it's about, it can get all over the news and lots of people know about it. And as good as all of that is, it's not really a match for the digitally sophisticated misinformation machine that we sometimes find ourselves up against. And you're seeing that play out with coronavirus in a number of respects. One is that people don't understand that science is a living process carried out by human beings, and we start off in one place and we do experiments and we come to a different place. And the easiest thing to see about that here is, when we started with COVID-19, people were worried that it was mostly being transmitted by transferring on surfaces. And so we were talking a lot about washing our hands and packages and stuff like that. But over the last 2 months, we figured out that it mostly goes through the air. So 2 months ago, Tony Fauci said, you don't need to wear masks. Now he's saying you do need to wear masks. To scientists, that makes perfect sense that we would evolve in our understanding. But the people who want to say we don't know what we're doing are saying, well, are pointing out that 2 months ago we said something different than we say now. Well, that's just because science is going through its normal course of action. And so that, that's kind of scary, that there's so much emphasis on science right now that it's an opportunity for people to take the natural course of scientific inquiry and use it against us. Another maybe more challenging one is that, we're now seeing the last few days a private company that produced fake data that were used in some of the hydroxychloroquine trials. So that's a malicious and terrible thing that these folks did. Now, the fact that we are just now figuring that out, and my heart goes out to my colleagues at The Lancet, for example, who've had to deal with this. The good news is science found it. We did exactly what we normally do, but now this is going to be used also to say that, we shouldn't be trusted. And so that's why being very, very careful about what it is that we know and what we don't know is so important. And so that's why I wrote that piece. And I am worried that even if we solve this whole thing, that we'll be accused of overreacting and not knowing what we're talking about, and that'll be used in these longer term battles we have, like climate change, to undermine scientific inquiry in our process.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think those of us who work on climate change, we're constantly thinking about the parallels between the COVID-19 crisis and the climate crisis. And especially, you know, this, what you've mentioned, the active lobbying against scientific evidence, in fact, you know, ignoring, denying, and lobbying against, to be able to continue with business as usual. You know, our hope is that, you know, this renewed attention on science can help the way that we address climate change. But you know, let's see, right?
Yeah, we just have to keep our head down and do the best we can. You know, I guess what makes me a little more hopeful is that I think there are some curves that are going against us, but it doesn't have to be the case that those curves just keep going up forever. It could be that there's an asymptote out there that will eventually hit. The number of people who trust science seems to be pretty stable. You know, it's between 70 and 80%. That's scary because that means there's 20 or 30% of the people who have been convinced by bots and cable news and politicians not to trust us. But hopefully, you know, there's a floor there on how low support for science can go. Only time will tell us whether that's true. Yeah.
So, you know, we're in this storytelling track here, and you know, you mentioned, you know, a publication in Science magazine is like shooting a, you know, cannon out into the world, and it gets a lot of attention. But something interesting that John Vidal of The Guardian said yesterday during a similar session, you know, that a lot of the, and he's a journalist, I mean, a lot of the language, you know, scientific and environmental language, in fact, it's almost meant to not be understood by regular people or people who are not specialized. And so, you know, his role, you know, he went on to say that, you know, sort of media and can serve as a vector of clarifying and helping convey some of these technical messages. So, you know, what, you know, science, because there's such a close connection with the media and you have science news, you know, how do you see media and other means of communication influencing, sort of helping the public understand science better?
Yeah, so I think the great science journalists, certainly the ones who work for us, but we do have respect for a lot of other science journalists at other places. I mean, Stat has some outstanding people, and Carl Zimmer at the New York Times does a really great job. Laurie Garrett does an excellent job right now. There are a lot of people like this that we have. Helen Branswell at Stat is really superb. And they're playing a very important role because there are a few scientists who are at the bench who are really good at putting things in context for the public. But that's not really what we select for when we go to find people who are going to produce creative and important science. If they have that, that's a good thing, and we need to get them out in front of people. But you know, a lot of scientists, we love our jargon and our ways of graphing things and our bizarre way of writing up scientific papers. And so we're very dependent on journalism to provide that bridge. And so at Science, for example, we have journalists who are excellent at explaining things to a broader audience, but we mostly think of our audience as scientists in other disciplines who are reading about something outside their field.
Yeah.
That's what we think of as our core audience. So when John Cohen writes a COVID paper, he's writing something that someone who's a physicist can understand, not necessarily someone who is in the broader public. Now, we've had a lot of stories that have escaped the gravitational pull of the Earth and gotten millions of views from the broader public about coronavirus. And I think that's because of the expert way that they were done. But you know, we need the journalists kind of the next notch over to take what we produce and do something with it for the rest of the public. And that's a very complicated and important process.
No, that's right. So, switching a little bit, just continuing the conversation, sort of COVID related research aside, you've got such a broad spectrum of understanding of what's being published because of your role. What areas of research do you see that are really taking off at the moment that you think will impact the future of how we do things? I mean, especially if it as relates possibly to environmental topics, since we are in the Global Landscapes Forum, but not necessarily.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think I think a lot of things with artificial intelligence are going to be very important, and how big data are used with satellite imagery and high sophisticated digital techniques to understand what's going on in the environment is very important and has a lot of potential. So we see a lot of papers with satellite images of industrial activity or changes in the landscape and things like that my colleagues who handle that for us do, and also analyzing pollutants in the oceans or in the air using related techniques. We have a lot more sophistication now about all of that. Using genetics to look at biodiversity and large genome-wide association studies that can be used to analyze the effects of changes in the environment on the health of people read out through their genomes. And then, we're seeing social science. Science Magazine does publish social science. We don't have a ton of social science papers, but we have a great editor whose remit is dedicated to that. And they tend to be very high profile papers when we publish them. And so, the use of large data tools to analyze things in the social sciences, I think also bears on a lot of the topics that your folks are interested in. Moving to some of the other fields, certainly in biomedicine, we've had this explosion of information because we have a technique called cryo-EM that allows us to determine the structures of biomolecules much more rapidly than in the past. And that has played a big part in the COVID story. But I think also, across all areas of science, cancer immunotherapy is still very important, just really at the beginning stages. And CRISPR is another area where science has been very active in genetics. And then in the physical sciences, there's a class of materials called perovskites that are very useful in catalysis. And there's a lot of activity in science around those. So that's a few things.
Yeah, that's great. I think people are taking notes in the audience. Well, I want to leave time, for audience participation here. So please, all of you out there, send your comments, send your questions. We're going to get to that. I have another sort of burning question just because of what's happening now also in terms of the protests that are happening really worldwide, given the recent tragedies of the killing of George Floyd and many other Black people at the hands of police in the US, in Brazil, elsewhere. And scientists and scientific organizations are actively speaking out against racism and the need for systemic change in our institutions. And this includes the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where you're housed. And we all, in our ways, have a part to play in changing this, in listening, learning, self-reflecting, and trying to affect change. In your career, you've placed enormous importance on enhancing diversity and inclusion in science, and that's part of this. What concrete steps are you taking in your role as editor-in-chief of Science to address racism, and other structural inequalities in the scientific community?
Yeah, well, first of all, police brutality and the brutal killing of George Floyd and so many others is unacceptable, and it's devastating. And for the people who particularly are targeted by structural racism. My thoughts are with them, and I'm energized that the little part of the world that I control needs to do a lot more. We need to make sure that we're taking care of each other in these challenging times. And science has a lot still to reflect on. Before I came to science, I was focused on addressing these issues in universities, and there, trying to make sure people of color had access to a college education and thrived in higher education and could imagine themselves in the future. Those were the kinds of things that I was focused on, and making sure that we built an administration that reflected the populations that we served. And in science, there are a lot of issues, and I'm just at the beginning of trying to figure out how Science Magazine can influence those. But if you think about the problems that science, with a small s, the world of science, has, we've done a terrible job of including marginalized populations in science. We don't have adequate representation in PI roles or in leadership roles, or even in graduate school. And that's because, we send a lot of messages that aren't welcoming. We know the way we teach science by droning on and writing on a chalkboard. That's something that was invented when it was just people who look like me who are in college. And we haven't updated that to account for the fact that we're trying to serve more diverse populations. And there's still a lot of abuse and inappropriate behavior that goes on in the world of science. And we write about that a lot in the journal. And we're also getting a lot of information, and we've had news stories about this, that the areas of science that are more likely to attract people of color are historically underfunded. And you can't ask for a better example of structural racism than that. That's the structure of science that is causing folks to have less success. So we're trying to figure out how can we use our amplification methods to bring attention to areas of science that have been traditionally underfunded. I have written, before all this happened, an editorial about how we need to update our teaching, but we probably need to publish papers about how that can be done. And as a lot of excellent leaders have said across higher education and across the world of science, we need to look. This isn't just a problem about police brutality. Of course, that is very important, and we should be empathetic and engaged in trying to change that. But the world of science needs to look in the mirror as well. And we'll be listening to people and thinking about ways that Science Magazine and the family of journals can address that in the months to come.
Thank you for that. So I will stop talking, stop asking questions. I will bring questions in now from the audience, and I'm getting those filtered here through chat. So let me see if I can do this. Okay, so we've got another. It's a bit of a similar kind of question to what we were talking about earlier, but a different take. It's a bit of this, do us a favor kind of understanding and respecting science. But the question is, the public kind of expecting immediate solutions from science, or policymakers expecting immediate solutions, in the time of crisis. So find a vaccine, rather than thinking about prevention and sort of the long game. So, how can we keep our eye on the ball of the long game and sort of, keep our heads down, keep doing the good work while responding to these immediate needs and engaging, in fact, with decision makers and the public who really, they want answers and they're asking for science, in fact. So you could just keep going with that.
So, I mean, as far as COVID and the vaccine is concerned, we ran a piece from Mike Cohen and Larry Corey, who were two of the people who really contributed a lot to the success that we finally had against some similar political challenges with HIV. And what they lay out in their piece is that it's going to take three different things. It's going to take behavior, social distancing and wearing masks. It's going to take drugs, which ultimately I think will be antibodies that are against the spike protein of the coronavirus, and vaccines. None of those things are going to do the job on their own. So one of the things we're fighting against is this narrative out there that says when we get a vaccine, then life's going to go back to normal. And that isn't true based on the people that I talk to. If we're lucky, the vaccine will be 60 or 70% effective. We may have to get 2 shots. We've got to give that to billions of people. And so even if we knew what it was right now, the years that it would take to implement that, and especially to do it not in the United States, but in places where it's going to be much even harder, and those folks deserve the vaccine just as much as anybody else. That the switch getting flipped with the vaccine is not out there in our future. And so we need to try to tell people that as best we can, and to invite them to start figuring out new ways to behave and act. And I'm very encouraged about the kind of session that we're having right now. I wrote an editorial before we knew about COVID saying it was time to start rethinking scientific conferences so that we could do a better job for the environment and also give more people the opportunity to attend conferences. I think now we're having real-time tests of that. I'm pretty encouraged about that so far. So those kinds of behavioral changes, we need to model that. And we need to try to get people to understand that this is this is going to take multiple things. And, getting back to the theme of what we're talking about, climate change is the same story. We need to learn to use less carbon. We need to think about new ways of engineering, doing geoengineering, or just engineering things that contribute to anthropogenic degradation. And it's a mixture of technology and behavior that's going to resolve the climate crisis, and it's a mixture of technology and behavior that are going to resolve COVID. So we just can't repeat those things enough. And to the extent that we can get our friends in the media who have wider audiences to amplify that, that's all to the good.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's great. So we're getting, it seems, a lot of questions about this misinformation idea, and maybe that even connects to people are going to be more online. People are going to be getting information from all kinds of places. You talked about these massive misinformation campaigns, in fact. How can we build defenses for this? How can we weed out the false research, the misinformation? I mean, as we increasingly, in fact, become more digital.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no replacement for political change as the mechanism for this. I can write the best editorials in the world, and I can, we've had a paper from Mark Lipsich's lab about social distancing that was, as viewed as many times as we've ever had a paper. The night it came out, there were 5 co-authors. 4 of them were in each hour of prime time in CNN. So we can't do any better than that. All right, that's as much scientific information as we can get out there in the world, and that's no match for the misinformation machine that we're up against, that's international. And like I said, this has been building. We ran an editorial about the anniversary of Earth Day that a lot of your readers probably saw, talking about the fact that when Earth Day was launched, it was launched by Republican politicians in the US. And when Barry Goldwater was first laying out his view of conservatism, it had a carve out for the environment. But by the time we got to the 80s, that went away. And that's mainly because there was sophisticated polling data based on location that showed that running against science was a good thing. So, it's, of course, science needs to do everything we can to communicate the best we can, but it's really a political problem. And we're living through a time where we have leaders in a lot of countries. And, the people in the US tend to think that these problems are just in the US, but we have India and China and Russia and even the United Kingdom, a lot of places where leaders, borderline autocratic leaders, or some people would say there already are autocratic leaders, are in charge, and they're weaponizing social media to fight against us. And so political change is ultimately the only way that we beat that back. Now, like I said, I'm hopeful that there's an upper limit to this. There was a paper in Nature about anti-vaccine sentiment, showing that there's a pretty strong slope in anti-vaccine sentiment. And that if you extrapolate it all the way out, eventually we'll have more anti-vaxxers than we have people who believe in vaccines. Now, they're making an assumption that that line keeps going up. So I hope they're wrong. I hope that there's a level of sort of human rationality that eventually will kick in. But that's an optimistic view. The zero order assumption is that this is going to keep going, and if it does, it's pretty dangerous. So the people who are marching right now and the people who are registering to vote, they're helping us, and we should. I personally am very supportive of what they're doing, because we're living through a very challenging and dangerous political environment around the world right now.
Yeah, that's right. I think we have a lot of communicators, journalists in the audience, and some of the questions that are coming in are focused on how they can help. So we touched on this, the role of the media, but how communicators and journalists can earn the trust of scientists. It's an interesting question.
Oh yeah, well, that's really important. The AAAS has a lot of programming it's in the AAAS, not in the science family of journals, that's aimed at this. And I would encourage people to check that out. One of the things that we do that I am a big fan of is trying to work with local journalism to provide scientific experts to local journalists. But I think the question you're asking is another interesting one, which is, how do we get scientists to trust journalists? And like I said, I think, there are science journalists who kind of span the spectrum, from the folks who write from science all the way to people who are at large mainstream outlets. And the more interplay we have among that group, the better. And so, the journalists consulting other science journalists and consulting other scientists and having a more interactive dialogue among all of those parties is really the key to it. And, some of what I worry about is that journalism sometimes tries to always have a quote from the people who disagree. And journalists, the journalists who write for me, who write for science, they're editorially independent from me. I don't tell them whether to do that or not. But if you're talking about, if you're writing a climate story, do you have to have that comment from the Cato Institute? I mean, that's a choice journalists make. I would say, there's a little too much of that kind of bending over backwards to be fair to people who disagree with us about things that we know are facts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because the thing about that, I think, all excellent journalists report facts as facts. And even if they have a different political slant than I do, the ones that are at excellent organizations report facts as facts. And interjecting opinions from people who disagree with those facts sometimes is counterproductive. So I guess I would challenge everybody to think about that when they're writing these stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I've sort of been learning how to communicate with journalists as a scientist, because I think we at CIFOR, we do a lot of sort of media interaction, and our research does get picked up. And I mean, what I find is that we're often trying to be so precise. We are precise about our work, and even just the word changes in the language. And then, journalism is totally different. It needs to touch hearts and minds of the broader public. And so our precision, we have to let go of that in a way through interaction with media. And I found that the journalists who I've interacted with have sort of really helped me with that process and sort of walked me through it and saying, can we say that a different way?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think an excellent example of that is right now with vaccines. So, and with immunity to COVID. So we don't know for a fact that you become immune to COVID for more than 3 or 4 months, because we haven't been studying for more than 3 or 4 months. So when someone asks a scientist, is there going to be long-term immunity to COVID? Well, the absolute precise answer is we don't know. But if you amplify that, it says scientists don't know whether there will be a vaccine to COVID. Now, if you ask most people that I talk to about this, whether they believe there will be a vaccine and whether there's enough immunity that people get if they get the infection, most of them will say yes. But it's very hard for scientists to say, yes, I believe there will be immunity to COVID without saying, but I don't really know until I do all these experiments. And if the public hears both of those things, then it creates confusion. So there is a very challenging communications problem between scientists talking the way we talk and having that be a simple enough message that it can be conveyed. And normally these things happen in the background, and people who read our magazine during normal times, a few 100,000 people every week, don't see all this drama playing out. But now with so much focus on science, we're seeing this all the time.
Yeah, that's right. So, okay, we have some other interesting questions here, and it's related kind of to earlier questions. This question on inclusion. So we have an audience member from Venezuela based in DC, asking how to bridge some of these language divides. Most of these high-profile journals are English language journals. How are we reaching Spanish-speaking and non-English speaking audiences?
So science is produces significant amounts of material that are in Spanish and Mandarin. And we have we do all of our, the entity that writes up our articles for the media also writes them up in Spanish. But in general, of course, we need to do a lot more on that, both in terms of the stories that we do, which are very international, and the news stories, and our authors are also very international. But it's primarily an English language publication. So we need more partners translating our stories into other languages and other places. We are very open and accommodating and don't get hung up on copyrights and things when journalists from other news organizations around the world ask us if they can reprint our stories in their language, wherever that is. And so I would encourage anybody who's listening to this who sees a science story that they want to run somewhere in the world to let us know. We have a group that handles that, and we're always very accommodating and excited for people to reprint our journalism around the world.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Sort of along the inclusion lines, and somebody was asking for specific examples of the underfunded areas of science that affect people of color, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so for sure, studies of racial disparities in healthcare. That is an area that attracts a lot of researchers who are people of color, and it's now very well documented by us, both in research articles and news articles. And there was another piece about it this morning in the Chronicle of Higher Education showing that there has been an underfunding of that area. And before I came to DC, as you said, I was in St. Louis, and that's where some of the largest racial disparities in healthcare are anywhere in America. And so, that's an area that I would like to see us put more emphasis on. We have been doing some, but we'll do more. I think one of the most heartbreaking things to think about on something like this is when you think about sickle cell disease. We've had the gene and the structure of the mutant protein for sickle cell disease for 60 some years, and we still don't really have an adequate way to treat that. It is a challenging scientific problem, but I think there are a lot of things like that where progress has been inadequate, and that hasn't just been because these are hard scientific problems. It's because there hasn't been adequate funding for that research. And so we need to figure out how to use our imprimatur to drive more activity in these fields. Certainly also things in the social sciences around racial disparities in policing and housing policy, school policy. These are all unfortunately inadequately funded, both by the federal government around the world, but certainly in the United States, and by the universities. Most universities have these programs, but they don't get as much funding as some of the more the flashier things that get more attention. And we have the ability to put a lot of attention on fields, so we need to start figuring out how we can do that to bring more attention to these disciplines that have been neglected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. We have more questions about fake news here, I think, because it's just so part of our reality now.
Yeah.
And the question is, should scientists take a political stance against fake news? In a way, I actually think your editorials are taking a political stance in a certain way, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the way I've been writing the last 2 or 3 months, I've obviously decided there's really no reward in trying to stay out of politics. Science is 3 things in our magazine. It's news, it's insights, which includes science policy, and it's research. And so it's certainly within our remit to comment on politics around the world as it relates to science. Right now, we're seeing a lot of what is going on in politics is related to science. So there's a lot to write about there. And that has been the case at Science Magazine over the years. The irony of this is devastating, but probably our most beloved editor-in-chief was Donald Kennedy, who was the had been the president of Stanford, and he was also the editor-in-chief of Science in the early 2000s. He also was very outspoken about, at that time, the Bush administration and his opinions about that. And sadly, he died of COVID. If he was the editor-in-chief now and in his prime, he would be blasting the politicians for not paying attention to COVID. So it was a tough, unfortunately, I never got to know Don, but he was beloved by my colleagues, and just the way things lined up that he ended up passing away from COVID, I think just was a stark reminder of the fact that science and politics are intertwined with each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you're active on Twitter, social media, there is this line between sort of research, advocacy, even what you retweet, what you like, what you comment on. It's scientists are part of these conversations as humans, and with all of our beliefs and ways that we think the world should be. So I believe, some of my favorite people to follow on Twitter, in fact, are scientists who are involved in these conversations actively, and what their positions are.
Oh, sure. And we don't shy away from that. I mean, our science is a human endeavor carried out by human beings who have opinions and make mistakes and are right sometimes and not others, and correct themselves, and interact in groups where there are psychodynamics. I mean, this is all part of science. And so to say that our opinions would somehow be off limits, I think isn't consistent with because as we're seeing, folks who think that science drops out of the sky in a textbook, now that they're seeing it in real time, are really having a hard time processing what we all know, which is that science is this messy living human endeavor. And if we have scientists who don't feel like they can express their opinions about things, then we're cutting people off from the beauty and drama, really, of the human achievement that describing the world really exemplifies.
Yeah, no, that's right. We're having a lot of social scientists, I think, are getting excited because you really frame that as sort of a growing area in Science magazine and the publications. And someone is asking about, understanding behavior change and the kinds of qualitative data or studies needed to understand behavior and what drives behavioral change. This is pretty interesting if we think about it in relation to COVID-19 or climate change. What is actually changing people's behaviors in terms of the decisions that we make as individuals and organizations in the context of these crises?
Yeah, well, I'm not the expert on that, but like I said, I have a colleague who is swimming in these papers right now and trying to figure out, with this crisis, but also preparing for the next one, thinking about what changes behavior. And we have data now on people's location, and we may know how they voted, or we at least know how their location voted. And so we're going to be able to start correlating these things in the months ahead. And I guess the hopeful thing would be if we can figure out what drove behavior change in COVID, maybe we can figure out how that would change behavior on some of these longer term things we've been talking about, like structural racism and climate change and environmental racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, please let us know your ideas about that, and we're very excited to hear what people think and this connection between what we can do with technology now and things that social scientists have known for years. How can we connect those in a way that is helpful to people? And when we don't publish very many social science papers, but over the during my time as editor-in-chief, every time we've published one, it's gotten a ton of media attention. And sometimes controversy, but that's okay. We like it when people are debating the origins of things.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess maybe message to scientists out there: interact with the editors at Science Magazine and throw ideas around and help influence actually the trajectory.
Yeah. Most of our editors, many of our editors are on social media, certainly on Twitter. Their names are in the mastheads of the journal. It's pretty easy to figure out which ones of them are in your field, and they're the ones that are doing COVID are very busy right now, but they're all extremely responsive and interactive. And if you need to get to the right person, you can write to me. My email is hthorp@AAAS.org. That's all over the world for anybody to find. We look forward to interacting with folks about their ideas. That's what we're here for.
That's great. Well, thank you. I think our time is at its end. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Holden Thorpe. You're a busy person, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with the Global Landscape Forum. You're a special guest for us. And I'd like to thank everyone who stuck with us. Some of you, it's very late at night at this point. So thanks for being here. And we look forward to the last and final day of the conference tomorrow. So with that, I'll say goodbye. Dr. Thorpe, thank you for being here.